The Bongcloud is a terrible opening. I think it goes something like f3, king f2, something like that. I'm not too worried about it because I'm never going to play it, but Hikaru Nakamura has played it and Magnus Carlsen has played it. But now it seems that Magnus has given up on the Bongcloud for the moment for another, well, bad move. How does he get away with playing bad moves in the opening? Well, he's the best player in the world. And there's also that old principle that says white is white. In other words, in chess, if you have the white pieces, you can get away with certain eccentricities. So let's look at this game played from Titled Tuesday, where Magnus begins the game with the white pieces with h4. Now, what does this accomplish? Not much. It does weaken some squares, but it gains space on the king side. Maybe the rook can develop on the h file later, but for the most part, the move doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's sort of Magnus being Magnus. His opponent, Grandmaster Paravian, plays it, I think, the right way here. He plays e5. When someone plays an eccentric opening against you, you just sort of play orthodox central chess. Keep the pieces in the middle of the board. That's what he does. c4 is played by Magnus, hoping to carve out this d5 square. Essentially, what he's doing is he sort of lost a tempo with the h-pawn, and now he's playing a Sicilian with this pawn at h4. That's basically what's happening here. Knight to f6, preparing the d5 push, then e3. Magnus has played 3 pawn moves, has not developed a single piece, but at the moment is preparing maybe to play d4 and gain some space in the center. His opponent goes ahead and plays d5, a good move. Pawn takes, knight takes. And here, knight to f3, putting pressure on the e5 pawn. Now, surprising to me in analyzing this game, this has actually been played before. And in the one game where this was played against, a couple of amateur level players, bishop to d6 was played, and the game did end in a draw. But here, Grandmaster Paravian plays knight to c6, a much more traditional approach, defending the pawn at e5. And you can really see the outlines of the Sicilian here. And Magnus plays knight to c3. If it were a Sicilian, this would be the 4 pawns. Now, Grandmaster Paravian plays this move. He takes the knight on c3, but one of the options available to him is knight d to b4, with the idea of dropping the knight into the d3 square with check. And here Magnus would probably play d3 to prevent that, but then bishop to f5, e4, because obviously he's attacking the pawn at d3, e4, then bishop to g4, and what we would actually have in this position is a Sveshnikov Sicilian reversed, with this h-pawn having been moved to h4, and I don't see how that is a good move in this position. It does weaken this g4 square, and I think black could have been very happy if he had taken that approach. But instead, he takes on c3, also a decent move. Pawn takes c3, and notice Magnus still has one piece developed. And here, probably bishop to d6 from black, just keeping it all together. When a very strong player plays a strange opening, you don't want to press too hard or you might end up in trouble. And what Grandmaster Paravian does here is e4. This is a standard idea in the 4 Knights Sicilian, but here it's probably not the best move because one of the problems is it then justifies this pawn on h4. And Magnus plays knight to g5. Notice, if the pawn were not here, this would not be possible because the queen could just take the knight. And now he's putting pressure on this e4 pawn, and he's basically the move he made to begin the game, which maybe wasn't that great, has now become a useful move. Grandmaster Paravian plays f5. This does weaken a lot of squares. If he wanted to avoid weakening those squares, it's actually quite hard because bishop to f5 defends the pawn without weakening the squares, but then queen to a4 comes, and the pressure is just building up on that e4 pawn. This queen also pins the knight on c6. So he just goes ahead and says, I'm going to defend that permanently and just deal with the weakened squares on this light diagonal. Queen to b3, immediately going after these weak squares. Carlsen sees the weakness, attacks the weakness. Black plays knight to e5. Now, this is a very important piece, right? He's threatening maybe to deliver check on d3 and get rid of the light squared bishop, but much more importantly, This knight is defending f7. It is the only piece defending against checkmate on f7. So if Magnus can dislodge this knight, it would be very tough for black. It might cost him a piece. But how to do it? d4 or f4, then the pawn at e4 will capture en passant. So how do you dislodge the knight? Well, Magnus plays this strong idea, f4. He plays it anyway. And now, after pawn takes pawn, instead of recapturing the pawn, he plays the move d4, ignoring the pawn, but going right after this knight on e5. If the knight moves, then queen f7 will be mate. He knows that. So how does black deal with this? I mean, he's already under a lot of pressure. Well, first he plays h6. He wants to kick away that knight. So instead of removing the knight, which would cost him dearly, he counterattacks white's knight on g5, which is essential for this mate threat on f7. Now this knight jumps into e6. Now this is a double attack for Magnus. He's attacking the queen at d8, and the pawn is attacking the knight at e5. And if black takes the knight with the bishop, then just queen takes check, and then this knight at e5 will fall after queen or bishop interposes. He just plays queen takes knight, and he's just winning a piece. So black instead plays queen to d6. This removes the queen from the threat of the knight, but also attacks the knight on e6 twice. One idea for white here was knight to f4. That puts some pressure on this g6 square, so that if black plays knight to g6, bishop to a3 hits the queen, and if the queen takes on a3, then knight takes g6, and white is in very, very good shape. So if the queen to f6, knight to h5 would hit the queen, queen to b6, taking on f8. After pawn takes g2, bishop g2, king to f8. And after the exchange of queens, white is only a little bit better with this superior pawn center and some more space in the center. But instead, knight to f8 was played by Magnus, getting that dark squared bishop off of the board. And here, the best move computers show us for black was pawn takes g2. And after bishop takes g2, knight to d3 check. And when the king goes to d2, knight takes the bishop on c1, rook a c1, then rook takes f8. And this is actually a fairly equal position. Even though black is up a pawn here, white has a lot of nice pressure. It's very hard for black to develop the queen side because of the pressure on b7. So this is really an equal position. But instead, in this very confusing situation, Grandmaster Parabian plays knight to d3 check. He plays the check sort of in the wrong move order. But it does allow this queen access to g3, which looks very, very dangerous for Magnus. He has to deal with the check, so he takes the knight. But now queen to g3 check, and we can see black's idea. After this check, he wants to take on g2 with the pawn, and this queen and pawn at g2 versus this rook will be very hard for Magnus to deal with. The question is, has he seen far enough that he'll be able to deal with these threats? King to d1, now fg2, threatening the rook. Rook to g1, this queen and pawn is a huge problem. Now black plays queen to f2. Now what is white going to do here? He's threatening to just take the rook, but also if the rook moves, he'd queen the pawn. Then when the rook takes the pawn, the queen would take the rook, and he would win the rook. How does Magnus save this position? Well, as usual, he's seen one or two moves ahead, and he plays this powerful idea, queen to b5, check. Now, if this king takes the knight at f8, then queen to c5, check. Now, if king goes to g8, then queen to d5, check, and when the king moves, queen takes g2. He connects the queen from b3 all the way to g2 with checks. What if after queen to c5 check, he plays king to f7? Well, then queen takes c7 check, and when the king moves, he brings the queen back to h2, defending the rook and hitting the pawn at g2 twice. And so for that reason, Grandmaster Parabian plays the move c6, blocking the check with the pawn. But now Magnus plays queen to e5 check, king takes f8, and then queen to h2. And he had to see that he was going to be able to connect the queen at b3 all the way to h2 a few moves ago. I mean, it's really an amazing insight. His chess intuition is really unmatched, maybe in the history of the game. Queen to f3 check is played by black. Bishop to e2 blocks that check, also attacks the queen, so he has to move it. Queen to e4. And now queen takes g2. So Magnus is threatening queen takes g7 check and also offering the exchange of queens. He's up a piece for a pawn. Now black would like to avoid that exchange of queens. He wants to keep queens on the board and continue attacking, but if he plays queen to e7, using his queen to defend the g7 square, the Magnus would have this beautiful move, bishop to a3, pinning the queen to the king. And even though this bishop is unprotected, it doesn't matter, because if queen takes bishop, queen takes g7 check, and very quickly he loses the rook, and the other rook is coming in. He'll probably mate it very, very quickly. That basically means queens are forced off of the board. Queen takes g2, rook takes g2, bishop e6, developing that bishop, and now h5, a very powerful strategic concept where this one pawn at h5 holds these two pawns at g7 and h6. Very, very strong idea, and gets that g6 square for white. King to f7, bishop to a3, putting the bishop on its best diagonal. Bishop to d5 hits the rook at g2. The rook just moves up one square. Rook h to e8, then bishop to d6. Magnus is threatening bishop to e5, followed by rook takes g7. Check. The rook goes to e4, but now Magnus goes ahead and plays bishop to f4, just defending everything. The idea is king to d2, rook a to g1, and destroying black on the g-file. And in this position, black resigned. How does Magnus do it with these ridiculous openings? Well, he understands the game at a deeply fundamental level, so he can play these kind of eccentric ideas. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.